I've stood behind locked plant gates in city after city, looking at grass growing in parking lots where they used to make steel, where they used to make cars, where they used to make washing machines, where they used to make bicycles. And now the plant gates are locked, and there's grass growing in the parking lots, and the neighborhoods around them are deteriorating. And people lost their jobs, and then they lost their homes. They lost their health insurance. They lost their pensions, or at least a big part of them. And there's grass growing in the parking lots. It's time that we had a president of the United States who had the willingness to challenge these trade systems and say what I'm about to say, and that is that my first act in office as president of the United States will be to cancel NAFTA, get out of the WTO.
I played it wrong.
When I started to grow up, I used to come into this park. I felt the way I do now. Just floating with happiness.
Look, what I said to you that night when I gave you the bracelet almost.
Don't talk about it anymore, Nicky. Don't talk about anything.
Why did you play it wrong? I couldn't go straight if I wanted to.
Maybe
Well, I was born and raised in the city of Detroit, in Herman Kiefer Hospital, the same hospital my mother was born in. It was great there. I've enjoyed my life here in Detroit. Enjoyed it immensely.
I believe in you, Nicky. If I helped you, would you try?
There was industry. There was a lot going on downtown, a lot of money being made. We have the Fords, we have the Firestones here in Detroit, we had the Dodges. It was just like any other big city. It would be just like if you went to Chicago and went to the railroad yards and all the trains are whizzing in and out and some passenger and some, materials and all that stuff. Same thing here. It was great there. It was absolutely great. That's what actually happened until they started to change things around. In the 60s and 70s, we had problems, we had strikes, we had civil rights issues, we had one of the largest riots, and that wasn't the first time we've had one here in the city of Detroit. I think we had one in the 40s also. It was going on in the 60s and plus the craziness of drugs that came here. When people started doing crack, that the whole mental thing changed. People became more desperate. I mean, super desperate. The cheap drugs, being swindled out of your money by companies like Enron and Silverado Bank and all this other stuff. I know a lot of people left the city to go to Texas and Oklahoma during the 70s for oil, and people started moving to California in the 80s.
That train station, well, it's got an interesting story. It was built in 1913, and they built atop this train station a 14-story huge hotel, anticipating that the railroad station was going to be the center of the city. That train station was built with a big optimistic vision in mind, I guess, and that never really panned out. The upper floors of the hotel were never completed. I remember coming and going to that train station. I mean, you walk in there to this big, huge train station, there's people waiting on these like benches that sort of look like pews or something in a church. And there'd be the snack bar, concession stand, whatever you want to call it. You go get some hot dogs and hamburgers and stuff, and the ticket booth windows and all that stuff, and this huge, ornate, elaborate stonework, all this marble and glass and these huge windows, and just the huge size of the place was just amazing, awe-inspiring. And then, you know, to experience that place as a living, functioning building, and then a few years back, in the early 2000s, going into the building at night with flashlights, a couple friends of mine, exploring it as a ruin. You know, there it was all dark and pieces of the roof falling down and debris in the floor and graffiti all over the place and the windows broken out and all that stuff. It was just like, wow, walking onto the set of some weird movie or something. You know, and to see this place that was familiar to me as a living thing sitting like that was, I don't know, it was fascinating, I guess, in a way. You know, and to know the story behind that place, to have actually experienced it, as opposed to just looking at it retroactively, like going to the old house and seeing the furniture or the pictures or something and trying to visualize the story, being able to visualize the story directly was really interesting, really interesting. You know, just to have it there as a ruin, I mean, look at that. The Acropolis is a center point of Athens, Greece, and it's a big thing. So, you know, a ruin isn't always necessarily a bad thing. You know, sometimes it's kind of a fascinating thing to have sitting there in the middle of a city to make people think about that other time or whatever, kind of a little picture of it, you know. But there's things like that I think, you know, I would be inclined to keep. And there's other things that would be really kind of unnecessary. I mean, all that, the glass and steel buildings, I mean, what do those do for the world? I don't know. This street was fully lined with houses, and most of these streets out here are. You know, some of these neighborhoods you go in, you see like, you know, whole blocks that are empty, and those all had houses. Some of the stories you see in these old houses when you look at them and all that are sad stories of people who had to leave their homes, or old people who passed away and the house was just left, or families that just had to go, you know. They just couldn't afford to stay there anymore. I wrote a word piece along the lines of that. It was like, it's about, do you believe in ghosts? And the answer was, yeah, I believe in ghosts. I see them every day. You know, pushing shopping carts and begging in the streets. What are these but the ghosts of children? The ghosts of these hopeful young children that were here years ago. And here they are, still these ghosts shambling around the streets. You know? So there are really ghosts. It's not like we think they are. Yeah. You know, I was reading an article the other day about a horse rescue shelter here in Michigan that just was simply having to turn away horses. You know, they just couldn't afford it. They were barely making their operating costs of purchasing hay and taking care of these animals, and there's so many people are just losing their homes and their places to keep their animals, and these abandoned pets breed, and then you have semi-feral animals running around. You know, I don't think there's a dog walking the streets of Detroit that isn't at least a good part pit bull. You know, that's become a popular thing. And then, you know, there's the whole dog fighting thing, unfortunately, too.
the Renaissance Center. The Renaissance Center was built in 1977, and when it was completed, it was the largest privately financed project in the history of the United States. Over $350 million of private funds were used to build the 73-story main tower with 4 40-story towers surrounding it. Henry Ford II was trying to bring a renaissance back to the city of Detroit, but it really didn't work as well as he planned. Instead of bringing lots of companies back to the city, he ended up pulling companies from other buildings in the city of Detroit and leaving them abandoned. Also, it was criticized for being very fortress-like in that it did not really integrate itself into the downtown area. It was more like a city unto itself. And even today, over 6,000 people work at the Renaissance Center, including what is now GM World Headquarters, a 1,500-room Marriott hotel, over 70 different restaurants and shops, a movie theater, a post office, its own YMCA workout facility, and it even has its very own zip code. But there was no front entrance to the Renaissance Center. There were large heating and cooling berms, which added to the fortress-like look of it, and really kept out people from around the city. And people would just drive in, go to work, and drive back out and never have to interact or even feel like they were in the city of Detroit. The Renaissance Center is one of the main stops on Detroit's People Mover. It is a very small elevated rail system that only encompasses 3.1 miles around the downtown central business district. It has 13 stops and was created in 1987 with hopes of going farther, but that were never realized. This is the Guardian Building. The Guardian Building was built in 1929 as a cathedral of finance. Over 2 million bricks were specifically made in an orange color to build this building. And the beautiful mural on the back wall, it depicts Michigan and the different industries that were popular in the 1920s. And it also has a large agricultural scene in the bottom left-hand corner and a large manufacturing scene in the bottom right-hand corner that depict the transformation of Detroit from an agricultural city to an industrial city.
I fix things for a living of all sorts and kind of live by my own resources. So an environment like that is really something I can adapt to more readily, say, than working in the corporate world or something, which I did do for a time. I worked for a major industrial electronics company and had my good taste of the corporate world and walked away from it and just preferring to fend for myself. We were a working class family. I was the youngest of 5 kids, and we mended our clothes and fixed our house and fixed the family car or whatever it took, and did all that for ourselves. And I guess I learned a lot of good survival skills from all that.
Look down, I don't want the land on his head.
Detroit is a wonderful place to visit and a wonderful place to live and to raise a family.
The city is reverting, but this isn't a bad thing. That's part of that transition of Detroit going from being the big industrial city to being more of a rural type situation. Peacocks and pheasants and birds like this you wouldn't expect to see in a city. You think of them as being out in the farms in the country, in the rural areas.
Detroit has the possibility to grow, most of its food, like a lot of its food on the vacant lots that it has. With that crisis in mind and the fact that Michigan in general is in somewhat of a economic crisis, people need to have other ways of making income, and hopefully it's, we can encourage people to use agriculture as a means of supporting themselves. And we help urban gardeners in the city to get the resources that they need. So we provide transplants, we provide soil, we provide seeds, compost.
My parents grew up through the Depression. I could see a lot of parallels with it, yeah. People just realizing that the big economic picture has failed, and so, like the Depression had those guys selling apples and pencils in the street, during the Depression. There's people here in Detroit who do whatever. They grow food in their garden, they'll set up a little stand and sell it, or trade it to their neighbors for something they have or whatever. And, less of the big money economy, more of the local barter economy and among ourselves and stuff. People learn to survive without money, or without that being such a big part of their lives.
Hi, John. Which one are you, John? Hi, John.
The bonfire is, well, I mean, that's an old thing. It goes back, I guess, to wherever, but, you know, this is where people gather. I mean, it becomes the center of the social thing here. The bonfire, everybody's here around it for light and warmth, but even on a summer night, when you don't really need the warmth, it's there. And, you know, something to gather people around. That's a tradition older than any of us, really. Go back to it.
So people are getting really excited about local food, and especially organic local food. But we're hoping that we can get more restaurants interested in doing the whole local thing and really appreciating food much more than, you know, the Coney Islands generally do and other restaurants like that.
Now as we come down here, you can see that it's a lot of trees. It's a lot of trees down here. So no, this is more like a habitation for the bees. This is more like a habitation for the mosquitoes, you know, and the wildlife, you know, the rabbits. You know, you got birds. You got birds that stay up here. You know, they set their nests up, and then you also got them further down.
This was would have been July 14th, 2003, and during the afternoon while we were hanging out here and all that, the power went out. You know, at first we thought, okay, the power went out, you know, a couple of hours, it'll be back on. And so one of them turns on the radio in their van, they find out, oh, the power's out in New York, and it's out all over the place. It's out through a lot of Ohio and, you know, a lot along the East Coast and all that. We realized this was a bigger picture. And it really didn't seem to disrupt life here much. I mean, it probably wouldn't have been much different had the power been on, really. The actual events of the night, other than the fact that it was darker and quieter, and, you know, the world outside. I remember sitting here later at night, and it was just like all the lights in the city were off. You don't see that glow at the horizon, and it was quiet. There weren't cars running in the roads, and it was a very quiet night in Detroit. And that was really interesting. And yeah, I think Detroit was probably better equipped to handle that sort of situation because of that mentality than, you know, let's say New York, where everybody lives in big, tall high-rises or something like that. Where, I mean, if you're on the 13th floor of a high-rise, no way to get up and down but an elevator, and the air conditioning goes out, that's a bit more of a problem than if you're in a big old house in the middle of a green field in Detroit. I guess it's good to keep that in mind, to be prepared for that, because, you know, it's going to have to happen sooner or later, or at least less technology in our lives. It's definitely going to happen sooner or later, I think. And I guess that's sort of an optimistic view in my sense there, not in the sense of a huge tragic collapse, but in the sense of a transition away from that, to, learn from it, but transition away from it. I guess that would be the big dream. And I think Detroit, of all cities in the U.S., probably has the best opportunity to make that transition, because now we're kind of cut loose from that big economic picture, just because of the collapse of the auto industry and how it's gone the way it has. There's a certain kind of freedom in that, a certain sort of liberation in losing everything. Now, I don't know, that's maybe a little more drastic than what Detroit would be. We haven't lost everything by no means. We still have a lot here, and more than we realize, I think.